Hello everyone, today we talk about a very special topic. We introduce for the first time on Schwerpunkt in absolute terms these three characters that all magnificently contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I will make more videos about this era in general, mostly the 1980s, as well as the general sort of background and prodrome to this. We will talk more about NATO, we will talk more about the Soviet Union and the entire, again, political, military, and also social roots to this. I made something about communism, Bolshevik ideology. If you're interested, I also made something about NATO already. But we really have to make way more contemporary history and warfare content to get to the point of also drawing sort of droves of subscribers for these themes. That's why today's one is really important. I will read the script here because it's really packed with a lot of very precise information. I wrote it down. At the end, we will make some conclusive consideration. However, you understand more or less where we're going with this. Ronald Reagan took office in January 1981 as the 40th president of the United States following his landslide victory over incumbent Jimmy Carter in the 1980 election. Amid widespread discontent over inflation, high interest rates, the Iran hostage crisis, and perceived U.S. weakness abroad, carrying a private assessment he had formed over 30 years of studying communism as a union leader, corporate spokesman. He had historically been a Democrat, as a matter of fact, governor and candidate, so with definitely a very different posture. Here and there, I'm going to comment, obviously, because I hope that you're aware of the sort of ups and downs, the sinusoidal trend in terms of NATO, so if you prefer the idea of the two blocks or sort of kind, even though they weren't really blocks as we intend them, geopolitics does not exist, as a matter of fact, throughout the Cold War, right? And you know that at the beginning of the 80s, the West was going under a profound crisis, that we partially already hinted at in these few phrases. And that, of course, the three characters we're discussing today were key to sort of turn the tide once again. This is sort of, it would require really a lot of context. As I said before, today's video is already long the way it is, so I promise we'll talk about this. But even if you're not aware of what was happening, please just check something like Able Archer, right? And also check essentially the rhythm of Soviet industrial plants at this point, their military investment. In part, we will see this now, and what was sort of prognosticated or ideated and always ready, like as a Cardenas lived by 1984, 1985, right? However, what we're talking about here is not, in fact, as all like much Soviet conventional power that, in fact, was somehow overblown, even though at the time it did really have the upper hand in merely European terms, very differently from today's Russia, for example. And, I have a series on Ukraine that explains that. We will see this more and better when we will analyze the air-land battle doctrine. We can also go back in time as far as Operation Unthinkable, obviously in very sort of dramatically different political and strategic scenarios. But at large what we're discussing here. The point is obviously always nuclear threats that balance everything out and also manage actually by deterrence not to turn the Cold War into a hot one, even though across the world there were definitely many wars, part of which we will see now. We will also come back on the original concept of geopolitics, because I can't just slam the concept, making you believe like at least that what you hear today in terms of how the concept of geopolitics is used is complete BS, right, in general. Like, originally speaking, there is a history dating back to the 19th century that has to do with a certain idea of power balance, for at least the political context of the time, that identified certain part of Central and Eastern Europe as basically the tip of the balance. That is more interesting, but it's not geopolitics still, it's something else. But that's the moment in which the term first was thrown around. What we're talking here is the fact that the Soviet Union was already by this point in the 80s, and it had always been actually an economic cripple, masquerading as a superpower, like kept afloat only by terror, secrecy. And this is essentially what Reagan expressed, like the idea that the West was a bit like today, like unwilling to press its advantages against the Russians. Reagan told his first national security team that the Cold War was not an endless stalemate, which is correct indeed, but a contest the United States could win, as they did, if it exploited the USSR's internal contradictions without apology. Right? This video is also a sort of memento disclaimer, it's, if you think about it, really recent history. For us who were born later, it seems like, I don't know, prehistory. That's really typical generationally wise. But just for saying how much of sort of the world has changed for the worse in moral terms, like what was self-evident at the time today is something that people start, fixating, sort of self-sabotaging and, getting scared, emotional about, and it's objectively ridiculous. Now, back to Reagan, in any case, every instrument, according to him, military, economic, technological, ideological, diplomatic, and covert, von Clausewitz would have simplified this in sort of just three at least, was therefore subordinated to a single strategic objective, force the Soviet system to attempt to match the West across all domains it could not possibly sustain simultaneously until something fundamentally cracked. And this recipe was actually correct. The military buildup was the most visible lever, and it was deliberately disproportionate. Within weeks of inauguration, Reagan approved a defense budget that would rise from $142 billion in fiscal 1980 to $222 billion in fiscal 1984, and keep climbing, a near 60% increase in nominal terms over 4 years, driven by Reagan's so-called peace through strength philosophy that is being at least notionistically rediscussed because it was part of course, American political language of the time in today's United States in a different context, and aimed at restoring U.S. deterrence after perceived post-Vietnam erosion. Remember, we're just 5-6 years away from the U.S. retreat from the disastrous Vietnam War, where nobody won, really. And I will continue soon, by the way, my series about the Vietnam War. Now, the B-1 Lancer, which Carter had terminated in 1977 after 4 prototypes had already flown, was resurrected and ordered into full production as a supersonic strategic bomber capable of low-altitude penetration with nuclear or conventional payloads, entering service in 1986 after 100 units were built. This has to do also with, again, airland battle doctrine. If you look at sort of a different level operation, the Tornado Panavi is sort of like, we'll talk about that at some point. Today we don't talk doctrine, if not in political terms, but we understand what here in particular the US investments to basically oblige the Soviets to match the American improvement by scale that would in fact collapse had it even been attempted in any serious sense, the Soviet capacity. The MX Peacekeeper, capable of carrying 10 MIRVs with accuracy measured in tens of meters, was approved for deployment in hardened silos and later on rail garrisons. A SEAL-based intercontinental ballistic missile, the ICBM, with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, the, in fact, MIRVs that we just mentioned, designed to counter Soviet heavy ICBMs like the SS-18, and deployed starting 1986. The Trident II D5 submarine launch missile, whose accuracy approach that of land-based systems, was accelerated. A submarine essentially launched ballistic missiles LBM with a range exceeding 7,000 kilometers and circular error probable CEP under 100 meters, right, entering service in Ohio-class submarines in 1989. The Navy was expanded towards a 600-ship goal, including 15 carrier battle groups and the recommissioning of 4 Iowa-class battleships, a fleet modernization plan under Secretary of the Navy John Lemon to counter Soviet naval growth, with Iowa-class battleships, the BB-61 to 64, reactivated in the early 1980s to surface gunfire and missile roles. In Europe, the deployment of 108 Pershing II and 464 ground-launched cruise missiles began in November 1983, despite massive demonstrations and Soviet threats to walk out of all armed talks that, as you know, were sort of a big deal on the newspapers, part of NATO's so-called dual-track decision of 1979 to modernize theater nuclear forces in response to Soviet SS-20 deployments. The Pershing II's flight time from West German launch sites to Moscow was publicly estimated as 6 to 8 minutes. Soviet war planners knew it was closer to 6. As a matter of fact, an intermediate-range ballistic missile IRBM with a 1770 kilometers range and radar-guided terminal accuracy, heightening Soviet fears of a U.S. first strike accordingly. When Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative on March the 23rd, 1983, he framed it as a moral alternative to mutual assured destruction. Quote, what if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies. But its real purpose was to actually confront the Soviet General Staff with a technological race they had no prospect of winning. This is the key aspect of it. A proposed multiple layered ballistic missile defense system dubbed Star Wars by critics, emphasizing space-based interceptors, ground lasers, and sensors to counter ICBMs. Now, internal Soviet memoranda later revealed that the Ministry of Defense estimated a serious strategic defense initiative effort would require them to spend an additional 300 to 400 billion rubles over a decade just to maintain parity, right? A sum roughly equal to their entire annual military budget. In estimates, in fact, from the classified Politburo documents showing the projected cost at that point at least much less, exacerbating in any case fiscal strains amid perestroika reforms. Economic strangulation was pursued with equal ruthlessness, which was entirely right. In December 1981, after the imposition of martial law in Poland, a crackdown by General Wojciech Jaruzelski's regime against the Solidarity trade union movement, as you know, amid fears of Soviet invasion under the Brezhnev Doctrine, Reagan imposed sanctions on the Soviet Union itself and on Poland, then extended them in June 1982 to cover equipment production by European subsidiaries of American companies or under U.S. license for the Yamal pipeline. It was a 1,400 kilometers natural gas pipeline from Siberia to Western Europe, valued at $10 to $15 billion, intended to supply, in fact, 40 billion cubic meters annually by 1995. This is very important because, as you know, the Warsaw Pact began to collapse. In fact, from Poland itself was the bigger, the most important country outside of the Soviet Union, and the Solidarność movement was a bit naturally like a form of socialism, definitely the leverage that was increasingly inflated by the sanctions that the Westerners put on these same countries, exactly to exacerbate the discontent against, of course, the already sort of overarching discontent towards the Soviet imposition. Now, the measure was, by the way, legally unprecedented and provoked fury in Western Europe even, because contracts worth billions were frozen, companies such as Dresser France and John Brown Engineering faced bankruptcy, and European governments retaliated by ordering their firms to fulfill the contracts anyway. This is an incredibly important page because it tells you how we've seen this over and over and over again. And somebody just whining because, I don't know, economy does bad in the moment because it hasn't have the cerebral capacity to understand that if from the other side they succeed, it will get much, much worse than any of that without any doubt, like is the hallmark of all it. In fact, Reagan, held the sanctions for 6 months before compromising, admittedly, but the pipeline's completion was delayed by a full year, and the episode demonstrated that the United States would risk serious Allied friction rather than Moscow, a guaranteed revenue stream. Simultaneously, CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency assessments concluded that the Soviet hard currency earnings were overwhelmingly dependent on energy exports, what does remind you. Quiet consultations with Saudi Arabia beginning in 1985 encouraged the kingdom to abandon its swing producer role. Right, as you know, from the 1970s, pretty difficult problems had arisen from the Gulf area for global market fuel prices. And this was another major move. Like production thus rose from roughly 2 million barrels per day to over 5 million in a matter of months. This was a deliberate US-Saudi strategy to flood the market and crash prices. Therefore, also Soviet income, as confirmed also in declassified Reagan administration memos. By early 1986, oil had fallen below $10 a barrel, and Soviet export earnings collapsed, in fact, from an estimated 40 to 50% in a single year. Hard currency revenues dropping from 20 to sort of $25 billion to under 10 per CIA estimates. Since the USSR was simultaneously importing 15 to 20% of its grain from the West and paying for it in hard currency. By the way, think about all the propaganda the Russians, producing grain, even though it was actually the wide majority was from Ukraine and Kazakhstan. The loss was immediately translated into reduced living standards and pressure on the satellite states, in particular, thus bringing about ever more the fracturing, the discontent within the Warsaw Pact. The ideological campaign was no less systematic. On June the 8th, 1982, in the Royal Gallery of the Palace of Westminster, Reagan told the British Parliament that, quote, the march of freedom and democracy would leave Marxism-Leninism on the ash heap of history, a landmark address outlining Reagan's vision for promoting democracy globally, attended by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and influencing NATO allies. Margaret Thatcher, who had arranged the invitation, called it a triumph that restored belief in victory among those who had begun to doubt. Right, amidst the eye of the crisis storm, remember that feelings actually among people were much stronger at the time than what we see today. Today we see a lot of tweets, but not really anything changing in practice in policy for obvious reasons that we also explained for the sort of unchangeable sort of political and strategic goals that particular powers have. That's paradoxically what people would call that geopolitics, as a matter of fact, even though, again, that is not a correct term. And also because, again, like in any case at the time, the world was overall much more on the rise than it is today. And so today we witness to the further distancing of the lesser people from actual government, which happens in each of these moments, as a matter of fact. On March the 8th, 1983, in Orlando, Reagan delivered the famous Evil Empire speech to the National Association of Evangelicals, insisting that the struggle was not between two morally equivalent systems. Think about this also today, also all the whataboutism, the moral relativism about, the constitutive fabric of inferior and superior culture, as a matter of fact. Reagan termed this, quote, the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil. That is to say, a direct rebuke to nuclear freeze advocates that indeed existed also at the time. Lesser people are always going to be lesser people. It's not like there is a moment in history in which that's not the case. They actually have a function to be under, right? And to strengthen those who are at the top. And framing the Cold War, in fact, as a moral crusade and coining, in fact, the evil empire label for the USSR. White House staff had repeatedly tried to soften the language themselves, right? Reagan restored instead every excision in his own hand, right? When you speak of nerves, iron fist, and providential wisdom. When Soviet Su-15 interceptors shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, famously enough, by the way, on September the 1st, 1983, after he strayed into Soviet airspace, killing 269 civilians. There was a Boeing 747, if I'm not wrong, commercial airliner en route from New York to Seoul. It had deviated 500 kilometers, of course, due to a navigation error, right? And this obviously prompted Reagan to label it a massacre. The US president went on television to call it, quote, an act of barbarism and, quote, a crime against humanity. The incident occurred at the height of the Euro missile crisis, because these were the years, man, Able Archer, and hardened Western resolve just as the first Pershings arrived. The Reagan Doctrine turned containment into rollback, a policy shift from Truman-era containment of communism to active support for anti-Soviet insurgencies, formalized in Reagan's 1985 State of the Union address. In Afghanistan, famously enough, aid rose from roughly $30 million in 1981 to over $600 million by 1987. You have Rambo 3, like at the time, how they were tanking the noble Mujahideen, that we know, unfortunately, how things ended up later. Again, these are the twists of history, but they're definitively not the direct way that happened, as a matter of fact. And this aid was channeled through Pakistan's inter-services intelligence, and including Stinger missiles, whose first battlefield use in September 1986 effectively ended Soviet close air support and forced Soviet commanders to shift to high-altitude bombing that was militarily useless in that theater and politically disastrous as well. You know what these are, Stinger man-portable air defense system, man-pads, essentially downed over 250 Soviet aircraft. Per CIA records, very easy to ambush those in those Afghan mountain gorges, as a matter of fact. In Angola, repeal of the Clark Amendment in July 1985 allowed overt military assistance to Jonas Savimbi's UNITA, National Union for the Total Independence of Angola. In 1976 was a congressional ban lifted amid Reagan's push to counter Cuban Soviet influence, enabling $250 million in U.S. aid by 1991, which by 1987 controlled a third of the country and forced the commitment of 50,000 Cuban troops that Luanda and Havana could not afford. The sort of African theater in 1970s, 1980s is incredibly fascinating. We'll talk about it at some point. Now, in Nicaragua, the administration sustained the Contras through direct appropriations, third country funding from Saudi Arabia and Brunei, and for a period the arms for hostages transactions later exposed as Iran-Contra. A scandal revealing National Security Council officials diverted $18 million from Iran arms sales to fund the Contras, violating Boland amendments. Smaller but significant programs aided the non-communist KPNLF, that is the Khmer People's National Liberation Front coalition in Cambodia, and you know what had happened there after the Vietnam War, and anti-Soviet resistance in Mozambique and Ethiopia. Those were vicious regimes, as a matter of fact. Now, Reagan made the doctrine public in his February 6, 1985 State of the Union address. Quote, "We must stand by our democratic allies, and we must not break faith with those who are risking their lives on every continent, from Afghanistan to Nicaragua, to defy Soviet aggression and secure rights which have been ours from birth." When Mikhail Gorbachev reached the General Secretaryship in March 1985 as the youngest Soviet leader since Stalin, inheriting power after the deaths of Andropov and Chernenko amid a gerontocracy crisis of sheer, in fact, generational dynamics and ruthless rigidity, the Soviet regime, he inherited a strategic disaster. In fact, the economy was growing at less than 2% annually, down from 5 to 6% in the 1970s. per CIA estimates, due to structural inefficiencies and resource misallocation, oil revenues were evaporating from $32 billion in 1984 to $13 billion in 1986 amid global price crash. The Afghan war was costing 2 to 3 billion rubles a year, equivalent to something like from 3 to 4.5 billion US dollars, draining 2 to 3% of the entire Soviet GDP annually, and the military burden already consumed 15 to 25% of gross national income, depending on the exchange rate used, estimates varying by methodology, with Western analysis pegging it at 15 to 20% amid Reagan's buildup. Gorbachev's reform program was not a choice but a necessity imposed by the pressures Reagan had methodically applied. The Geneva Summit of 19 to 21st of November 1985 was staged for personal assessment. This was the first Reagan-Gorbachev meeting hosted at Fleur de Villa, yielding no treaties but establishing rapport. Reagan arrived deliberately coatless in the cold to greet Gorbachev, projecting vigor against the younger man's heavy overcoat, as a matter of fact, as a matter of style and of scene, of course, from Reagan's past. In the private session at Fleur d'Eau, Reagan opened by saying the United States and Soviet Union were the only two countries that could start to prevent World War III. That at the time was really correct. Then spoke of their shared rural childhoods and the possibility of cooperation against an extraterrestrial threat, like it does point, because a fireside chat where Reagan floated the alien invasion scenario to emphasize unity, Independence Day scenario. This is in fact resonating also in cinema and so on, and later confirmed by Gorbachev himself. But that was an interesting political expedient as well. Like this fact that Reagan would go on saying that as it would happen, regardless of the ups and downs, that at some point some kid born and raised in the United States could play, basketball, or I don't remember what it was with a kid born and raised once, in fact, in Soviet Union, was an important psychological approach to this. It's like we want to wipe the hell out of you. I want to make you understand this is not going to continue. It's objectively ridiculous and embarrassing and shameful enough. Just diplomatically speaking, you can't say that out loud, but it was kind of obvious, as a matter of fact. It's not, again, Gorbachev was the saint or whatever, but he found himself into the eye of the storm from the Soviet side, and he had to cope with it with practical results. But I don't think in that sense, if things could have not changed, they would have not changed. And this would be interesting to comment on in a sort of even metaphysical sense, but we'll see now it happened. It's a matter of imperium, as a matter of fact. Reagan pressed hard on Jewish immigration, the Afghan war, and human rights, but also left the idea that an alien invasion would make both sides forget their differences. Gorbachev later confirmed the exchange and Reagan's seriousness about the latter point. Now, no treaties were signed, but both men concluded the other was someone they could do business with. Reykjavik, on October the 11th to 12th, 1986, was the moment the dam almost broke. A hastily arranged, quote-unquote, working summit of the House, yielding famous pictures from that, dramatic proposals, but collapsing on strategic defense initiatives. In 48 hours of nearly continuous session of the House, the two leaders discussed eliminating all ballistic missiles within 10 years. Think about how the world still saw this possible. I'm not saying that, again, they were right, but in general, in fact, not in naivete, but the idea that the struggle was so harsh between the two that this was seen as we are the only ones who can turn the world into ashes right now, so we also have theoretically the opportunity of both disarming. Then, in fact, all strategic offensive arms, even to be again eliminated, and finally all nuclear weapons altogether. Gorbachev offering a half cuts in strategic arms and a 10-year nuclear freeze even. Gorbachev offered to accept deep cuts in heavy ICBMs, the core of Soviet second strike capability, if strategic defense initiatives testing were confined to laboratories, a concession on parity in exchange for the anti-ballistic missile treaty adherence, Reagan refused, offering instead to share the technology once it worked, a proposal Gorbachev dismissed as unrealistic, Reagan viewing strategic defense initiative as essential for post-nuclear security as well. He naturally was right about that too. When Gorbachev asked if Reagan was prepared to lose a historic opportunity, quote, because of one word, Reagan replied it was a matter of principle, referring to laboratory restrictions on strategic defense initiative. The summit ended abruptly, but the concessions Gorbachev had already tabled revealed how desperate Moscow had become to escape the strategic box Reagan had built. All right, this is naturally a weak posture, and it ipso facto reveals that the system could not be sustained, as much as the fact that the United States were absolutely confident instead they could crush their opponent at this point. The Washington summit of December the 8th to the 10th, 1987, delivered the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, eliminating 2,692 missiles and establishing verification regimes that allowed inspectors into the most sensitive facilities on both sides. The first time the Soviet Union, by the way, had ever accepted such intrusion. A bilateral accord removing an entire class of ground-launched missiles, range 500 to 5,500 kilometers, with on-site inspections for 13 years. The Moscow summit of May the 29th to June the 2nd, 1988, saw Reagan cheered in the same red square, speaking beneath a 40-foot Lenin at Moscow State University on the virtues of individual liberty and free markets, a victory in and of itself, in address to 600 students, praising glasnost and perestroika while critiquing communism's failures, and signing bilateral agreements on fishing rights, student exchanges, and cultural programs while Soviet history textbooks were being hastily rewritten and classes canceled because teachers, no one knew which version of the past was now permissible, which is sort of ridiculous enough for something called a country to begin with. Now, on June the 12th, 1987, Reagan had stood before the Brandenburg Gate and delivered the line his own speechwriters and the State Department had tried 7 times to delete. Namely, the extremely famous, quote, General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, because bear in mind, nobody really believed at the time that the Soviet Union would have collapsed the day after, all right? And so this was an enormous issue. That's also why, in part, in prospect, the process was so laborious at a point that you want to appreciate. We'll save these reflections for the end of the day. But how absolutely confident you can destroy a nuclear power, regardless also the political consequences there, right? How many people sort of masquerading some sort of moderates say, oh, but if we destroy Russia, we'll have nuclear weapons scattered. You have no idea what politics is and how it works, what kind of scenarios open, right? If you have a 4-year-old exclusive imagination, apocalyptic scenarios as a namely adult person, it's because you haven't the palest idea of what politics can do, all right? Nor what the military, as a matter of fact, or society can do. And just to conclude, the famous lines from the Berlin speech, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate, Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. A defiant challenge, obviously, during, by the way, Berlin's 750th anniversary, which will, if anything, about the origins of Berlin in the crude and brutal 12th century. Now, but almost similar to Moscow, as barely existed at that point, broadcast live to East Berlin and amplified by Radio Free Europe, as a matter of fact. And the words were broadcast live, by the way, into East Berlin and repeated endlessly on Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. And you see from the other side was no one, by the way. That was on purpose. And 29 months later, in fact, that very wall was rubble. All right, the Soviet Union never meaningfully increased its military budget in response to Reagan's build-up because it could not. Right, defense spending stagnated at 15-20% of GDP per declassified estimates, unable to match U.S. increases without further starving civilian sectors, as a matter of fact. And again, there would be massive digressions on this very topic, but you understand that that's something that historically Russia is not able to win, right? Still today. Now, by 1987-88, the combination of collapsing oil revenue, the Afghan quagmire, and just, I will not draw any comparison, but you perfectly know what we're talking about here. The cost of, by scale, by what, the cost of subsidizing Eastern Europe, that was naturally artificially propped in a pro-Soviet direction. The burden of matching Western technology had pushed the system to the edge of fiscal and political breakdown. If you're interested, I also made a video about 1956 Hungarian Revolution, but again, I will also expand later, 1968, etc. Now, hard currency shortages as well, exceeding $10 billion annually, exacerbating Gorbachev's reforms. Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost were attempts to relieve the pressure by loosening internal controls. Instead, they exposed the rot beneath the surface. The Red Army began withdrawing from Afghanistan in May 1988. Cuban troops left Angola under the December 1988 Accords. Poland held semi-free elections in June 1989. The Berliners danced on the wall in November. By the time Reagan left office in 1989, the correlation of forces had inverted, right? As it is to this day, the Soviet Union had not been defeated in battle, was not even the need to do so. It had been compelled to recognize in the most concrete and humiliating terms that it could not longer afford to exist as it had for 7 decades. Reagan's strategy had turned the Cold War from a contest of endurance into a demonstration that the Soviet system was structurally incapable of surviving open competition with a confident West. For those, by the way, just think that violence per se is just the only resort. It should be, hopefully the last or something around there, because war is most of the times not the right answer, but you must know how to fight one. And here we're not really talking about how advanced actually the US military really was. You've seen by spending, but in also technical, doctrinal, qualitative terms, etc. But literally, this is providential imperium. That's how deterrence can dissolve your enemies without even having them fighting. And this is really beautiful, as a matter of fact. Then we pass to my favorite. I confess, I have a soft spot for her, Margaret Thatcher's. Margaret Thatcher's engagement with the Soviet Union spanned 2 full decades and moved through distinct phases, each marked by precise words and actions that cumulatived into a single, unrelenting argument about the structural impossibility of the Soviet project. It began quietly enough. In the summer of 1969, as a junior minister in Edward Heath's shadow cabinet, as the newly appointed opposition spokeswoman for transport, Thatcher made her first visit to the Soviet Union. Her self-effect-finding trip that exposed her early to the realities of communist governance. I have family memories myself, like in terms of sort of visits to the Soviet Union from an external point of view in the 70s. Now, in October of the same year, she marked 10 years in Parliament with a speech that already hinted at the direction she would take. By early 1970, she was telling the Finchley press that she wished to see a complete reversal of the permissive society at home, a phrase that carried unmistakable implications for the external struggle as well. Remember that, again, we come from the 1960s. We are in some decades of sort of intense red-black terrorism and so on. So it's a moment where so-called contestation, whether it is supposed to be a Marxist attempt to destroy civilization, of course, was arising. And historically, Thatcher, as you know, came to power with a specific mandate to properly destroy what had been the abusive sort of social policy that had followed essentially the victory and the bitter victory in World War II, as a matter of fact. And so the the economical, the ideological they're overlapping, not just that as well. Now, 6 years later, on the evening of January the 19th, 1976, everything crystallized. Speaking at Kensington Town Hall to an audience of conservative supporters in a major foreign policy address known as the Britain Awake speech, Thatcher delivered what the press release had embargoed until 8 p.m., by which she performed with only minor stylistic changes from the prepared text. She accused the Soviet Union of being bent on world domination, of using the Helsinki Accords as cover for further advances, signed in 1975 to ease East-West tensions, but criticized by Thatcher as enabling Soviet gains, of intervening directly in the Angolan civil war while the West slept, literally, were Soviet-backed, in fact, MPLA, the People's Movement for Liberation of Angola, rage against Western support factions. She reminded her listeners that the men in the Kremlin did not have to worry about the ebb and flow of public opinion, which is correct, that they put guns before butter, while, quote, we put just about everything before guns. She cited concrete figures. The Soviet Union was already outspending the United States on military research, weaponry, ships, and strategic nuclear forces, claiming 20 to 25% more annually on research and development and equipment, per her speech citing Western intelligence estimates. Within 3 days, she would herself observe British Army war games in Germany, facing a Warsaw Pact advantage of 150,000 men, 10,000 tanks, and 2,600 aircraft, highlighting NATO's conventional inferiority in Europe. NATO's southern flank, the Mediterranean sea lines, the oil routes, and the North Sea rigs were all increasingly exposed, while Britain had lost its overseas naval bases and the Royal Navy shrank. She contrasted Britain's per capita defense spending of roughly £90 with West Germany's 130, France 115, the United States 250, and even neutral Sweden's 160. As you know, Sweden was a bit like, Yugoslavia on the other side. They were not fully aligned, but they were still somehow within more like sphere than another. And she denounced the Labour government's planned cuts of almost £5 billion as turning the Secretary of State for Defense into the Secretary for Insecurity. She invoked Solzhenitsyn's description of the Cold War as the Third World War that the West was losing, referencing the exiled dissidents' warning about Soviet expansionism, quoted recent statements by Brezhnev and the ideological writer Konstantin Zarodov about the inevitability of world proletarian revolution, as a matter of fact, and warned that unless the West awoke from its long sleep, Britain would find itself on the scrap heap of history. 5 days later, Captain Yuri Gavrilov in the Soviet Defense Ministry newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda ran a long article under the headline, quote, "The Iron Lady wields threats," a derogatory nickname intended as an insult, comparing her to Bismarck, as a matter of fact, so unfavorably to the Iron Chancellor of 19th century Germany. Reuters picked up the phrase instead. Western agencies followed, and within a week, Thatcher had embraced the same Iron Lady nickname in her Finchley constituency. Quote, "Yes, I am an Iron Lady. After all, it wasn't a bad thing to be an Iron Duke." Right, and she was obviously likening the nickname positively to the Duke of Wellington, as a matter of fact. That also in terms of sort of continental intervention was something. When Thatcher entered Downing Street in May 1979, following her general election victory as leader of the Conservative Party since 1975, the rhetoric became policy without delay. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that in December 1979 was, it's interesting also from an operational and strategic point of view, it was a full-scale intervention to prop up a communist regime. By the way, this in an Islamic and feudal country, good luck with that. A bit like, you try to expect democracy flourishing there, it's a bit difficult. And condemning it as proof of the bankruptcy of the tent as well. Like, so what kind of the tent do you want if you are acting in this way. She helped persuade reluctant British athletes to boycott the Moscow Olympics, though not fully successful, with some participating under Olympic flags, gave only weak public backing to President Carter's economic sanctions because Britain's own economic situation was too fragile at that point, and most NATO allies refused to sever trade ties. And so just think, even all these references and reported to what you've seen in these last years. Yet in secret, Whitehall authorized MI6 and the SIS to undertake, quote, disruptive action inside Afghanistan in coordination with the CIA's Operation Cyclone, the largest covert operation in history, funneling billions in aid via Pakistan, as we've seen before, with Reagan supplying money, weapons, training, and intelligence to the Mujahideen, focusing on groups like Ahmad Shah Massoud's Jamiat al-Islami. From 1981, her government quietly provided quote-unquote non-lethal military equipment to Saddam Hussein's Iraq, amid, obviously enough, the Iran-Iraq war. It's a very interesting war, aside from the different things, but also in terms of who actually sold what to whom, because there were some, Western countries were also sort of selling stuff to Iran, to actually both sides at the same time, and vice versa. So there is, we will see that better. It tells you how much the concept of bloc does not quite exist. And so the paranoia that also today you hear amidst people that want to this hyper conspiracy theories where everything works like a clock and everything's pushing for it. That's not, I don't know how to tell it, not how history actually works. And the fact that you're undereducated is not an excuse for saying such BS in any case. And this was obviously tilting against revolution in Iran. So the revolution of sort of alleged sort of socialist revolution under the auspices, in fact, of the Soviet Union, that, of course, enacted the regime that we're pretty well aware of today. It's also probably one of the single most ridiculous ones in the history of mankind. Now, after withdrawing diplomatic recognition from the Pol Pot regime in 1979, following, we said it before, the Khmer Rouge's genocidal rule exposed, it nevertheless arranged from 1983 for the SAS to train the armed forces on the non-communist Cambodian resistance loyal to Prince Sihanouk and Son Sann on the Thai border. We're talking the aforementioned KPNLF, as well as, in fact, the ANS, the Sihanoukist National Army coalitions to counter Vietnamese occupation and maintain UN seat for the anti-Vietnamese coalition that include Khmer Rouge allies, so that the coalition retaining the Khmer Rouge could keep Cambodia's United Nations seat against the Vietnamese installed government in Phnom Penh. Now, the real turning point, however, came only with the arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev. Obviously enough, so from the British side, Thatcher had already met him briefly at Chequers in December 1984. This was a lunch meeting where she famously declared, "I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together." Which is also, again, the right attitude. Because also what you see in these last years, especially in the last year, for obvious reasons, if you're trying to broker deals, regardless of how you conduct yourself and what happens as a collateral damage and what things are there is obviously just a political face that everybody's aware of, except apparently the emotional masses on social media, right? And including the ones that are instead pushing to the other side, obviously, but acting as if they could manipulate reality as if these policies were actually giving them reason of some sort. And on that occasion, Thatcher also declared that she could do business thus with with Gorbachev, elevating his own profile in the West as well. So as a Trojan horse of some sort, she followed his early moves with close interest, reading his January 1987 plenum speech carefully and noting its monumental scope, outlining ambitious perestroika reforms. Their decisive confrontation took place on March 30th in 1987 in the Kremlin. During her official visit to Moscow, the first by a British prime minister in over a decade, in a small room with only advisors and interpreters present. Gorbachev began by welcoming the first high-level British visit in 12 years. Actually 20, Thatcher corrected, since a conservative prime minister had last come. Stressing the shared responsibility of nuclear powers and permanent Security Council members, Thatcher replied that key to progress was mutual recognition of equal security, lower arms levels, and above all, trust. But that trust required understanding not only what each side wanted, but why, which is the key of this all, after all. And she immediately acknowledged the Soviet Union's enormous military power, superiority in intermediate-range missiles and strategic offensive warheads, if counted individually, in chemical weapons, and in conventional forces almost everywhere, but insisted that this very superiority was unsustainable because it rested upon an economic system that suppressed individual initiative and incentive, echoing, of course, also her deep free market convictions. She drew the sharpest possible distinction. Every state was capitalist in the narrow sense that it administered capital and sought profit, but only a system of private ownership within an independent legal framework and an uncorrupted judiciary system of private ownership liberated human energy and created real prosperity. She reminded Gorbachev that it had taken her 8 years to turn Britain in the same direction, on a different basis, of course, and that she had followed his own efforts with intense interest. She listed Soviet and proxy interventions, Yemen, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Angola, Nicaragua, Cuban troops in Africa, Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia, and above all, the invasion of Afghanistan, as evidence that communism still pursued world domination, and she refused to accept Gorbachev's protestation that no such doctrine had ever been officially proclaimed. When Gorbachev accused her recent Turkey speech of reviving the spirit of Churchill's Fulton address and the Truman Doctrine, the 1946 Iron Curtain speech and 1947 containment policy, she replied that no one thought the Soviet Union weak, only that its strength was misdirected and ultimately self-destructive, which actually was another way of saying that it was weak, but for saying, like, you're basically stupid in continuing in this direction to begin with, and that direction naturally was entailed by the entire communist ideology, and much more in the way it was handled. The exchange on nuclear weapons was particularly revealing. Thatcher insisted that conventional superiority had never prevented war in Europe. Hitler had attacked the larger Soviet Union in 1941, and that only the existence of nuclear weapons had kept the peace for 4 decades. Eliminating them entirely would simply restart a conventional arms race and tempt aggression the moment one side believed and enjoyed decisive advantage. Even a world with far fewer nuclear weapons would be safer than a nuclear-free world in which conventional imbalances could again be exploited. This is very interesting, by the way, and underrated in Thatcher's view, in my opinion, because she had actually a very consistent idea of the importance of deterrence of nuclear weapons. But if you report this to sort of these recent years, you understand that the possibility of escalating just in a moral posture, because you feel somehow that your things have complicated a bit today, to say the least, in general across the whole world. But let's say that the nuclear option, although again really inconsiderate and a real last resort in any practice, is still something that you can waive in terms of sort of disproportion of, say, in that sense, power, as some kind of moral oppressor, right, repressor, so to say, even when the other side has just enough to destroy your own country as well in the same way. So this is being waived a lot, and in fact does solicit power shifts, uprisings, sort of sabotage, etc. Now, Gorbachev accused Thatcher of hindering real disarmament by defending nuclear deterrence. And because that, as we've seen, was also something that Gorbachev was hypocritically using also in the discourse with the United States, and just because the same Soviets were always sort of lying by Doctrine, as a matter of fact, regarding their real intentions, and at this point feeling really the heated pressure on their parliamentary machine. Thatcher countered that NATO's doctrine was purely defensive. No NATO weapon would ever be used except in response to attack, and that nuclear weapons remained the most terrible yet most effective guarantee of peace ever invented. And the two are in accordance to, and especially the first referred to the Soviet Union. For those who are going to whine again because of NATO attack in Serbia, just be aware that if you don't carry out ethnic cleansing and you don't sponsor genocide abroad, like nobody bombs you, as a matter of fact. Now, we'll talk about that too, as a matter of fact. Now, 3 weeks later, on April 16, 1987, Gorbachev reported to the Politburo that the visit had been the right decision after all, acknowledging Thatcher's arguments on Soviet stagnation and Western fears. He described Thatcher as a fervent anti-communist who had argued without notes for hours, who had left the first day agitated and almost panicky, who had repeatedly insisted, "We do not believe you," telling them in their face, while citing Hungary 1956, Czechoslovakia 1968, and Afghanistan 1979, and who had connected the Soviet Union's internal stagnation directly to its external behavior, which was a surgical diagnosis. He admitted that the real fear of the Soviet Union, not just the military-industrial complex, sustained Western armament, that the West was deliberately trying to exhaust the Soviet economy, and that Thatcher's core argument had landed with force. In other words, it's not just because there is a superpower out there that can be dangerous in and of itself, but it's because of the very nature of the Soviet Union, the very nature of communist behavior and ideology, the way the Russians always posture themselves, continuously lying, probably as a very specific way of negotiation, right? The Chinese, for example, do not negotiate like that. The Europeans, say the Westerners, do not negotiate with that. In Russia, the point is not much just disinformation, but lying continuously, just to get something in the bargain, because you're always so constantly desperate about your situation that you literally have no other way out of this, which is not a way out in any case. Just think about, by the way, what we very well know concerning in the European theology, the fact that if you just say a lie, the imperium flies away, well, on a regular basis. And so just think the vile, cowardly, like terrorized, like metaphysical essence of a communist, also from an anthropological point of view, and in its sort of degenerative counterpart. Now, less than a month later, on May 8, 1987, the Politburo was openly debating the conventional imbalance everyone already knew existed: 170,000 more Warsaw Pact troops in Central Europe than NATO, of which 70,000 were Soviet, and whether to admit it publicly. Gorbachev declared that strategic parity was not a statistical counting game, but a political condition in which the Soviet Union could be secure with far less hardware, that the old approach of matching the West rifle for rifle against 6 billion people working on armaments was bankrupt, and that continuing to turn the country into a military camp would mean the end of socialism itself, for obvious reasons. By the time Thatcher returned to Moscow in April 1989, a reciprocal visit amid warming relations, the tone had changed again. She now spoke as someone who had herself carried out the painful restructuring Gorbachev was attempting. She told him that breaking the old order was psychologically the hardest part, that people felt uncertain when the state no longer told them where to work and what to do, that tangible results were essential or resistance would grow, and that in her own case it had taken 2 full years before the first signs of success appeared amid constant criticism. She warned that the Soviet budget deficit and the monetary overhang, incomes rising faster than consumer goods production, were symptoms of an economy that had lost control of incentives, and she rejected the idea of simply borrowing abroad to flood the market with imported goods as a substitute for real reform. Gorbachev acknowledged the interlocking character of all the changes, economic, political, democratic, nationality, party, and described perestroika as a second socialist revolution that could not be carried out in sequence but only simultaneously, which was naturally a way to attempt concealing, of course, to its own people the fact that they had brutally collapsed and that had nothing to do, in fact, with any sort of socialist revolution. In September 1989, in one of the most extraordinary exchanges ever recorded between a Western and a Soviet leader, a private aside during a Moscow meeting with interpreters asked to stop note-taking, Thatcher took Gorbachev aside and, asking that the interpreters stop taking notes, told him confidentially that neither Britain nor the United States wanted the unification of Germany. It would undermine the post-war borders and the stability of the entire international situation, and that the West had no intention of interfering in or accelerating the decommunization of Eastern Europe. Consider this was happening, again, as things were definitely spiraling down. Thatcher was particularly sort of convinced of the fact that Germany could simply unite with an Eastern European power to still basically capitalize on this, again, at that point, manpower advantage that would have created Europe. But this was actually a deep misunderstanding, right? And you can understand it even in a British perspective in many ways. So regarding the decommunization, how we want to call it, this would become like a massive, unstoppable wave that, in fact, went beyond even the sort of best West pronostics. That's also in part why the West said, okay, this thing collapsed, it's not going to resurge in any other way. It was, for decades, a sort of a mistake. It was fruit of the failure to realize of how actually weak the Soviet Union was, but also how, in fact, under-culturedly aggressive, in fact, the people living like as the Soviet Union, as a matter of fact, would be toward resentment towards somebody who had taken away the sort of the ragamuffin imperialistic ambitions, all loaded again in this sort of deep inferiority complex towards the West for sort of self-evident macroscopic reasons. This speech, this at least whisper, revealed deep Western anxieties amid collapsing regimes, which is also something, as we said before, was in any case a byproduct. It's not like bad things can happen, but it's not like, because they're unpredictable at that point and manageable, and so the Westerners did worry about that legitimately, but it's not like, again, they were probably overly cautious, considering in hindsight is easy to say that, right? But remember that there was still the aura of nuclear threats, of all the possible sort of tail strikes that a dying animal could give at that point. And just the ideas about the new order that would have formed. Gorbachev confirmed that the Soviet Union would not impose solutions on its allies so long as the Warsaw Treaty remained intact. Yet the central proposition Thatcher had advanced since 1976, sharpened in 1987 and reiterated in 1989, that the Soviet system as then constituted could not indefinitely afford its global military posture while denying its own citizens economic freedom and incentive, had already become the operating assumption of the Soviet leadership itself. From the Kensington speech that earned her the Soviet nickname she turned into a weapon, the Britain Awake address that defined her anti-communist stance, through the covert campaigns in Afghanistan and Southeast Asia, including controversial SAS training for non-communist resistance in Cambodia allied against Vietnam, through the unyielding intellectual assault of March 1987 that left the Kremlin visibly shaken, forcing Politburo reflections on sustainable burdens, to the sympathetic but mercilessly realistic Council of 1989 that recognized the enormity of the task yet insisted on its necessity, Margaret Thatcher had articulated, demonstrated, and finally persuaded the Soviet elite of a single coherent truth. The Soviet Union, with its combination of imperial ambition, ideological messianism, and centrally planned stagnation, could not afford to exist. The minutes of the Politburo in the spring of 1987 record the moment the diagnosis was accepted. The conversations of 1989 record the consequences as they unfolded. Now, let's pass to Pope John Paul II. The election of Archbishop of Krakow Karol Wojtyła, born in Wadowice, Poland on May 18, 1920, who experienced Nazi occupation, forced labor, and Soviet-imposed communism firsthand, as Pope John Paul II on October 16, 1978. The first non-Italian pope in 455 years, and the first from a communist country, very much in line with his times, was not processed in the Kremlin as a religious event. It was treated as a declaration of total ideological war. Right here, we are actually in front of the most important character of these, and for deep theological reasons as well. Intelligence analysts in the Lubyanka and the Central Committee produced urgent memoranda noting that the new pontiff was 48 years old, physically robust, like he had been a sportsman, fluent in Russian, Ukrainian, and Polish, had survived both Nazi occupation and Stalin's terror, had spent 4 years doing forced labor in the Solvay chemical plant where caustic soda permanently scarred his lungs, a Krakow quarry and factory job during World War II to avoid deportation, had hidden from Gestapo sweeps in the Archbishop's palace cellar in Krakow, had studied for the priesthood in a clandestine seminary while wearing factory overalls, had seen Jewish childhood friends marched off to Auschwitz, losing many classmates and friends in the Holocaust, had watched the Red Army arrive as supposed liberators only to impose a new dictatorship, and had then spent 33 years watching the Polish church be slowly strangled by the same regime that had deported every single Ukrainian Greek Catholic bishop to the Gulag between 1945 and 1949, following the forced quote-unquote reunion at the 1946 Lviv Pseudo Sobor. The last chapter is incredibly important. I shall make an entire video dedicated entirely to the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, especially in this period, because I made some videos about the history of Ukraine since inception that describe, in fact, the radically important role of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in alliance with Rome as opposed to the Orthodox one. That is exactly where the deepest sense of Ukrainian national identity reemerged throughout the 18th and 19th century. I made some videos about this again, especially the one on Habsburgic Galicia, as a matter of fact. But here, Wojtyła's experience is also a great part of what essentially an average Polish person would have in the first place. And we will understand now better how this would play, as we already hinted at before, like Poland being the most important country of the fact the same Warsaw Pact. It was a Warsaw Pact for a reason, as a matter of fact, outside of the Soviet Union. Now, Moscow understood that this man did not need theoretical lectures on communism. He had lived it in his bones and memory, and he had no intention of negotiating its right to exist. Within the first 100 days, Wojtyła began dismantling the entire Ostpolitik apparatus, Vatican policy of detente and dialogue with communist regimes under Paul VI with surgical ruthlessness. Cardinal Agostino Casaroli, the architect of quiet coexistence, was kept as Secretary of State but stripped of independent initiative in Eastern Europe. Archbishop Luigi Poggi, the Vatican's principal negotiator with Warsaw Pact governments, was reassigned to ceremonial duties. Bishops who had spent decades cultivating quote-unquote realistic dialogue with Marxist regimes, remember that there were sort of Catholic fringes that were so-called sort of from the left side, but mostly following sort of social policies, right, in sort of otherwise pretty big and essentially right-leaning Catholic, and also in fact decisively sort of in-charge Catholic parties. In Italy, that was the case, for example, even though it was, in fact, the largest communist party in the West there. And this was important very much for France, a Catholic country, very much challenged by the so-called contestation, etc. So these guys who had, even within the church, tried to think that there could be some sort of dialogue with Marxist regimes, were at this point retired or transferred to posts where they could do no further damage under Wojtyła. Naturally, the Vatican at large was not a fan of, say, of the Soviet Union or any other communist regime. In Redemptor Hominis, promulgated on March the 4th, 1979, Wojtyła's first encyclical emphasizing human dignity against totalitarian systems, and read from every Polish pulpit, by the way, on Palm Sunday, the Pope declared that any political system that attempted to sever man from Christ and reduce him to an instrument of historical or economic forces was intrinsically unjust, and that the Church had inescapable duty to defend the transcendent dignity of the person against every form of totalitarianism. The Polish regime immediately banned state printing houses from reproducing the encyclical, because of course the Polish regime was a socialist puppet of the Russians. Within 48 hours, underground presses in Warsaw, Krakow, and Gdansk were producing hundreds of thousands of copies instead. The opening strike against Moscow's most sensitive nerve came over the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And so again, this Byzantine Rite Church, in full communication with Rome since the Middle Ages, forcibly suppressed and merged into the Russian Orthodox Church in 1946. This was also historically tied to Poland from the times of the Commonwealth, etc. Now, on March the 19th, 1979, John Paul II sent Cardinal Józef Slipki, Major Archbishop of the UGCC, that is the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, we'll call it this way now, imprisoned between 1945 and 1963 in Soviet gulags, like still living in exile in the Collegio di Sant'Anastasio in Via del Tritone in Rome, and open letter timed for the forthcoming millennium of the baptism of Kievan Rus, marking 1,000 years since Christianity's arrival in Ukraine. The text praised by name the 10 Ukrainian Greek Catholic bishops arrested in 1945 and subsequently murdered in Soviet camps, reaffirmed the Union of Brest of 1596. We've seen this in a video, uniting essentially Ukrainian Orthodox with Rome as an irrevocable ecclesial reality, because it was already existing. Invoked Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights against the forced annexation of the Church to the Moscow Patriarchate, and called for the right of every believer to profess his own faith and participate in the communal life of his own church. The letter was smuggled across the border in diplomatic bags and by couriers within days. It was read from underground pulpits in Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, Ternopil, and Transcarpathia, despite immediate KGB threats of 15 years sentences for, quote, anti-Soviet agitation. Just for saying, that Ukraine did not exist, right? People think that Ukraine did not exist, say, before the 90s. It's like saying, you don't even know what USSR actually means. It's something embarrassing. Now, Moscow's reaction was instantaneous. The Moscow Patriarchate cancelled a long-prepared Catholic Orthodox theological symposium scheduled for Odessa in May. Metropolitan Juvenali of Krutitsy sent Cardinal Johannes Willebrands a formal note demanding an immediate, quote, explanation of the exact meaning of the papal letter and threatening, quote, public criticism of the Vatican's anti-Soviet course. Oh my God, we're going to be scared. And Leonid Kravchuk, the Secretary for Ideology in the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine, launched a coordinated press campaign denouncing the Pope as the vanguard of, quote, imperialist subversion. But this is uncommentable, by the way. In the first 6 months of 1983, underground Uniate priests, because the Uniate Church is the Greek Catholic one, because of the union with Rome, were found murdered. in circumstances that bore all the marks of professional liquidation, by the way. 3 more were sentenced to terms of 10 to 15 years, and of the KGB intensified infiltration using newly developed psychological techniques designed to provoke internal division among the catacomb clergy. Because this was all underground, all right? Now, in Poland, the regime attempted preemptive containment. In November 1978, Brezhnev dispatched a personal letter to Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński, primate of Poland, known as the, quote, primate of the millennium, warning that a papal visit would be regarded as interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign socialist state and hinting at, quote, serious consequences. John Paul II replied that he intended to celebrate the 900th anniversary of the martyrdom of St. Stanislav, patron saint of Poland, killing in 1079 for opposing royal tyranny. The 11th century bishop hacked to pieces on the king's orders for defending ecclesiastical independence, a historical parallel that every educated Pole and certainly every communist censor understood perfectly. From June the 2nd to the 10th, 1979, the Pope conducted what amounted to a 9-day national plebiscite on the legitimacy of Marxist rule, his first papal visit to Poland, drawing massive crowds and sparking a, quote, revolution of conscience. Official statistics, deliberately minimized to save face, admitted to 13 million participants. Independent observers calculated 15 million in a population of 35 million. This is grandiose, by the way. One of the largest gatherings in history, with events in Warsaw, Gniezno, Częstochowa. I also made a video about, the famous stand during the deluge in the monastery fortress, Krakow and Auschwitz. In Victory Square, Warsaw, on June the 2nd, the crowd was so dense that military helicopters ordered to film the event could not descend below 200 meters. When the Pope concluded his homily with the words, quote, "Let your spirit descend and renew the face of the earth, this earth," a prayer invoking the Holy Spirit for Poland's renewal. The answering roar lasted several minutes and was audible several kilometers away. Right? This is something enormous. And if you love Warsaw as much as I do, I fell in love with that city. I didn't think so, but you feel the burden of history, and it's something terrible. It's the beauty, the sort of the delicacy of the architecture of the site of the position, understanding what lays underneath. It's something unforgettable. And in Krakow, Pope John Paul II celebrated Mass in Wonia field before an estimated 2 to 3 million people, still the largest gathering in Polish history. In Gdansk, he stood on the exact spot where workers had been machine-gunned in December 1970. These were the protests crushed by regime forces using an altar built from shipyard scaffolding and carried a 20-foot cross welded by the men who would found Solidarność 14 months later. This was yet to come. At Częstochowa, the night vigil drew so many pilgrims that the surrounding fields looked like a military encampment under candlelight. Regime television, unable to black out the broadcasts without provoking immediate riots, was forced to transmit hours of live footage showing the nation united in a way the party had never achieved. Never. This speaks volumes about the Holy Ghost / Imperium. The visit proved beyond any possible argument that the communist state had lost the monopoly of public space and that the Polish nation recognized a higher authority than the Central Committee. All right? I will stress that Bolshevism subordinates humanity, that is already not something to be particularly flattered by, to the means of production, just metaphysically speaking, just for saying what this meant on the opposite end. The organizational consequences followed with vertiginous speed. On August the 14th, 1980, workers occupying the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, later named simply Gdansk shipyard, posted 21 demands. The first was the right to an independent trade union, which naturally was not possible under communist regime. The second, a monument to the victims of 1970, bearing the cross and the relief of John Paul II that he had blessed the previous year. This is incredibly moving. I'm honestly withholding myself here because it's terribly powerful. It's something that if you think about that, how many of you have read this on history book? I mean, seriously, right? Instead of stupid socioeconomic history and other sort of structuralistically, Marxistically derived lesser people fodder. Like this is incredibly beautiful. When negotiations stalled, the Pope sent a personal letter to Cardinal Wyszynski, read from every Polish pulpit, again on August the 31st, declaring that, this is quite literal by the way, declaring that the church supported the workers' just demands and called for dialogue rather than repression. So solidarity, żelazny, samorzeczny Związek Zawodowny Solidarność, the first independent trade union in the Soviet bloc, was legally registered on November the 10th, 1980, with 10 million members, more than the Polish United Workers' Party itself. This also alone speaks the world. Its gates were guarded by portable, and don't be fooled by this, like it was full of socialists, right? These were largely lesser people themselves. It was possible only in this form, in a context like that. In many ways, both voluntarily and involuntarily, at least, righteously and wrongly. Its gates were guarded by portable altars, so that's also very curious in many instances, like how, the confusion of the masses in front of sort of a communist, a socialist tradition and Christian Catholic faith. In any case, its banners were carried the Black Madonna of Częstochowa, icon at Jasna Gora, Poland's national symbol, and its negotiations opened with mass celebrated on overturned crates. In January 1981, Lech Wałęsa, a Gdansk electrician and Solidarity leader, traveled to Rome with his wife and 8 children. The photographs of the shipyard electrician kneeling for the Pope's blessing were reproduced illegally by the millions and became the most potent piece of anti-regime propaganda in Eastern Europe. Moscow attempted to solve the problem with 4 bullets, and we all know this dreadful, unspeakable act of communist inferiority. On the May 13th, 1981, Mehmet Ali Ashkar, Turkish gunman linked to far-right Grey Wolves, by the way, the single most dangerous terroristic organization in the world, fired at point-blank range in St. Peter's Square. One bullet passed between the radial and ulnar arteries of the left hand. Another perforated the abdomen, missing the mesenteric artery in the spinal column by millimeters. The Pope lost 75% of his blood volume, yet survived. All right. And that's also something like many investigations suggested Bulgarian/Soviet involvement via the so-called Bulgarian connection, though unproven definitively. There is still a lot of sort of mystery behind this. From the Gemelli Clinic, the most prestigious Roman hospital, Pope John Paul, and Catholic one, the Pope dictated letters to the Polish bishops that were read the following Sunday, insisting on non-violence. There would be much to digress here when we answer questions thinking that Christianity is meek, as if power did not manifest through this into destroying the Soviet Union. And without Wojtyła, things would have not gone the way we know, right? But also, in fact, he insisted on the inalienable right to truth and justice. Cardinal Stanislav Dziwisz, who rode in the ambulance and remained at his bedside, later testified that John Paul II never wavered in his private conviction that the order had come from the Kremlin. The Italian Parliamentary Commission of 2006, statements by former KGB defectors, and the documented involvement of Bulgarian military intelligence all pointed to the same conclusion, even if the ultimate archival proof remained classified. When General Wojciech Jaruzelski, Polish communist leader, declared martial law on December the 13th, 1981, imposing military rule to crush Solidarność, turning 10,000 activists, outlawing the same organization and sending tanks into the streets. John Paul II became the only functioning national institution left standing in Poland. He maintained encrypted radio and courier contact with the underground leadership, issued public appeals that combined calls for reconciliation with absolute refusal to recognize the military regime's legitimacy, and organized a clandestine supply chain that kept the resistance alive. Money, printing presses, ink, medicine, and shortwave transmitters flowed through ecclesiastical channels that the regime could not completely seal. It's useless, by the way, to do so, and counterproductive. Priests carried cash investments, nuns smuggled radio parts in market baskets, and the Vatican Bank handled transfers later estimated in the tens of millions of dollars. Simultaneously, the Pope maintained maximum pressure on the Ukrainian front. In March 1980, he convened the first open synod of the banned Ukrainian Greek Catholic bishop in Rome since 1939. In December 1980, a second synod unanimously declared the 1946 Lviv pseudo-sobor canonically null and void. When Moscow protested through every available channel, the Pope replied on January 24, 1981, with a carefully calibrated note that refused to withdraw the declaration while expressing willingness to discuss, to quote this, the modalities of publication, a formula that satisfied neither the Moscow Patriarchate nor the Ukrainian faithful, but kept the issue burning. A second strategic axis opened with Washington. Full diplomatic relations between the Holy See and the United States were restored in January 10, 1984. They had been broken since 1867, by the way, I would like to stress, for all the Irish, the Italians, etc., that had been in the United States, with almost no domestic opposition. Ronald Reagan and John Paul II had already met privately in the Vatican Library on June 7, 1982, the first meeting forging a quote-unquote holy alliance against communism, 15 months after both had survived assassination attempts within 6 weeks of each other, right, notoriously, again. And again in Fairbanks, by the way, in 1984 and Miami in 1987. Reagan really, risked it a lot, Cheney took bullets for him. Now, the classified National Security Decision, Directive 75, signed by Reagan on January 17, 1983, explicitly listed, quote, support for Solidarność and the Catholic Church in Poland as strategic objectives. CIA Director William Casey made repeated secret visits to Rome, shared satellite reconnaissance of Soviet troop movements, and received in return detailed reports on morale inside the Polish church that no technical means could provide. When you mean spiritual authority. The Pope, for his part, repeatedly urged Western leaders not to lift sanctions on Poland. This was extremely important, right? What we were saying before about Reagan. This is not just like throwing the Poles under a bus. On the contrary, it's making it happen, right? It's making the regime collapse. In fact, until the same Wojtyła said, until genuine pluralism was achieved, and warned that any premature compromise would only prolong the agony, right? Also, sanctions do not work. Yeah, sure. Inside the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church began its resurrection the moment fear began to recede. In September 1982, Josip Terelia founded the Initiative Group for the Defense of the Rights of Believers and the Church. After his arrest and sentencing, the leadership passed to Vasil Kobrin and then to Ivan L. They published the Samizdat Chronicle of the Catholic Church in Ukraine, later replaced by the Christian Voice, and organized public liturgies at the great Marian shrines of Zarvanitsia and Oshev. In 1984-1985, the crisis of priestly generations became acute. The last priests ordained before 1946, in fact, were dying without replacements. This is literally what was happening in the Soviet Union. And the new generation of crypto-Catholics, so undercover, was growing up attending Orthodox liturgies in rite, but uniate in identity. In August 1987, bishops Pavlo Vasilik, Sofram Dmiterkov, Philemon Korchab, and others publicly emerged from the catacombs and called on the Pope to support legalization, quote, in every possible way. When the regime refused, the movement escalated. Open-air masses drawing tens of thousands, petitions with hundreds of thousands of signatures, and on May 17, 1989, an indefinite hunger strike by 4 bishops and 10 priests on Arbat Square in Moscow that dominated Western television for days. On September 17, 1989, approximately 150,000 Greek Catholics marched through the center of Lviv, the largest unauthorized demonstration in Soviet history to that date. On November 26, another 100,000 demonstrated specifically for the restitution of St. George's Cathedral. To their fate, the regime retreated step by step. On November 20th, 1989, the Council for Religious Affairs issued a declaration that effectively recognized the right of Greek Catholic communities to register. Between January and June 1990, more than 1,500 churches in Galicia and Transcarpathia were peacefully transferred back, often with the local Orthodox clergy converting en masse, by the way, because these were exactly the areas where the Greek Catholic Church had been truly a national identity of the Ukrainian people. There weren't Russians. And by the end of 1990, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church had 1,592 registered parishes, 767 priests, including 186 monks, 485 seminarians in reopened seminaries, and approximately 700 nuns. Cardinal Miroslav Ivan Lubachevsky, whom John Paul II had made cardinal in 1985, returned from exile in 1991 to a free Ukraine. Poland moved even faster. Roundtable talks opened on February 6, 1989, negotiations between regime and opposition leading to semi-free elections. On June 4, 1989, exactly 10 years to the day after the Victory Square Mass, partially free elections gave Solidarity every contested Sejm seat and 99 of 100 Senate ones. On August 24th, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, Solidarność advisor and Catholic journalist, intellectual, close collaborator of the Pope, was elected prime minister. The first non-communist head of government in the Eastern Bloc, by the way. And on September, because it started from everything started from Poland, like collapse. On September 12, 1989, the last Soviet combat troops began leaving Polish soil. Right on Christmas Day, 1989, the Polish Parliament voted to delete the word socialist from the official name of the state. On December 1st, 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev landed at Champino Airport and was driven directly to the Apostolic Palace. This was the first Soviet leader ever to cross the thresholds of Peter's successor, acknowledging the Pope's role. Gorbachev later said the Iron Curtain's collapse was impossible without him. And he was right. He was right. During the 2-hour private audience, he told John Paul II that the collapse of the Iron Curtain would have been impossible. When you mean that there is a power on this earth that cannot be dispelled, right? That no other power can stand against it. Think about this. Not even the strongest. And Gorbachev pledged full religious freedom at that point and agreed to establish diplomatic relations with the Vatican. 11 days earlier, the Berlin Wall had fallen. Within weeks, the Velvet Revolution swept Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, and Bulgaria. Romania's dictatorship ended in bloodshed over Christmas 1989, which was also pretty funny, telling the truth. In fact, on December the 25th, 1991, the red flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The historical actors themselves closed the debate with a clarity that left no room for academic equivocation. Lech Wałęsa said, quote, "Before his pontificate, the world was divided in two blocks. Nobody knew how to get rid of communism. In Warsaw in 1979, he simply said, 'Do not be afraid,' and later prayed, 'Let your spirit descend and change the image of the land, this land.'" That was the beginning. And General Wojciech Jaruzelski said, quote, I would argue the historical case in three steps. Without the Polish Pope, no Solidarność revolution in Poland in 1980. Without Solidarność, no dramatic change in Soviet policy towards Eastern Europe under Gorbachev. Without that change, no Velvet Revolutions in 1989. And this is correct, by the way. If you think, again, that simply the Soviet Union would have collapsed under its own sort of stupidity, in a sense, yes, it was already doing it by itself. It had already brought about all the preconditions for it. But it could have not happened if from the other side hadn't been some action as well, and a universal one in nature. Mikhail Gorbachev, on multiple occasions after 91, said, quote, "The collapse of the Iron Curtain would have been impossible without John Paul II. Ronald Reagan, presenting the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2004, said, quote, "This son of Poland, whose principles stand for peace and freedom, has inspired millions and helped to topple communism and tyranny." George H.W. Bush wrote in his diary that the moral pressure exerted by John Paul II had been, quote, "absolutely decisive." Through an unbroken, meticulously calculated chain of decisions, the 1979 letter to Sleepy that prevented the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church from being forgotten, the June 1979 pilgrimage that demonstrated the regime's impotence before a nation in prayer, the immediate and public support for Solidarność to transform a trade union dispute into a national liberation movement, the preservation of hierarchical continuity in the catacomb church, the coordination with the United States that turned moral resistance into irreversible international pressure, the refusal to compromise on the anthropological truth that no system built on the negation of God could endure, John Paul II forced the Soviet Empire to confront the one reality it could not assimilate: a universal moral authority that spoke the language of truth to power and commanded the loyalty of millions prepared to suffer for it. The Soviet Union discovered, at the price of its own existence, that it literally could not afford to continue existing in the same world as a pope who refused to fear it and reincarnated the very truths it had to deny in order to illusorily survive. This is, in my opinion, one of the most important trios in history, and an effervescent combination of political, moral, religious force that found one of its greatest expressions in a time in history that wasn't absolutely seen in the moment, in those very years, for anyone who can tell you, having passed through it, as a positive moment. There was paranoia. They were making movies, also some are famous, the United States, of Soviet paratroopers landing somewhere. The United States, the oil crisis from the previous decade, the miners' strike in Britain, the bleak future. The fact that the Soviet Union seemed like a threatening giant, always a step away from launching World War III, almost the thing could also almost happen even just by mistake, for how tense the situation actually was, as a matter of fact. And definitely with powers that were projecting that force and that they were absolutely planning to enact this. Like 84, 85 were the years in which essentially the Soviets could have, but it was last useful chronological window where they could have actually launched an invasion of Western Europe. And we would have been the first ones to be turned into ashes, nuclear ashes, as a matter of fact. How things would have objectively escalated, regardless of the race at that point for the United States to arrive in time once again in Europe. The matter is, we would have lost the world in the process. And so and especially as a military historical channel, when we talk about theology, when we talk about spirituality, and we point out like the value of Christian values. Also, I don't like the term democracy, as you know. I think it's a misconstructed and probably etymologically wrong word in the usage that is made, right? It's not like that I hate what in good faith is meant as with this terrible world. Is exactly the way that free people win wars. And wars are not won just because, but because, as Clausewitzians, we also know that this depends on will. It depends on will to victory, a political guidance that Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, perfectly incarnated. And that I think we should incredibly learn from. There were also different people. If anything, Reagan and Thatcher were similar to an extent by nature. They were different characterally speaking. There were many other actors for that matter. Wojtyła was really actually a cold, strong, resilient, determined man. So he had evidently learned, right, the entire package. Like also consider what happened to Poland, not just before communism, but also before Nazism, etc. So we will come back on Polish history for that reason. And I would say the importance of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, that is probably the single most underrated faith in Europe, and the Uniate Church really being a massive pillar of Catholic tradition that completely takes away, in fact, the most important part of Eastern Europe, historically, culturally, morally, from the idea of this sort of plain barbarism and subcultural inferiority that communism expressed in its lowest form, indeed, with the Soviet Union, in Europe at least. And of course, like the second most embarrassing thing, at least by scale, because there were also other embarrassing things, worse things, obscene things in relative terms, before we mentioned like what happened in Cambodia, Somalia, but Maoist China, as a matter of fact. And this is nothing to do, by the way, with some kind of, say, forgiveness is important. If you can redeem your enemy instead of crushing, humiliating him without like that's good. But in this sense, don't think that this was a sort of simply happy ending, because as we've seen, things have not ended at all, and things do not simply end, right? You must want something, like also after peace. And let's not tie it to any specific political issue of our time, but remember that evil self-perpetuates, all right? Because it has the capacity to disintegrate good much more easily, at least, than good can self-perpetuate itself. It is tendentially. This does not mean that the right thing is, in a sense, like the right thing always wins, right? But somebody must enact it. So if you know the doctrine of the two natures, being and becoming, you know that while there is a truth, what happens on earth is in our hands. This world exists because of our sin to begin with. And so I think events like this prove that our beliefs are true, that no power on this earth can withstand the divine one, by definition. I mean, this wouldn't traditionally even be needed to be stated, but in the sense of how, say, accessible, how immediate, how imminent the potential to enact divine power on earth through the Holy Ghost, the sacred imperium, really at reach, right? And this is perhaps the greatest lesson that we have to learn for a past that, I don't know, when you look at is normally like, the 80s, like this, I love movies or songs from like, yeah, I do too, for that matter, but there is, if anything, a little bit more than that. That's, I think what the 80s should be a bit sort of better remembered for, and a bit more understood also in a generational sense, because we definitely had the opportunity of knowing people from those generations, right? We had gone the same 20th century in its horrors, our grandparents, in understanding how close this was at hand. This is where our parents lived, at least parents, people of my generation, of my class. And I never said the specific year in which I was born, but it's easy somehow to understand. And in that sense, really appreciating that opinions do not really matter when you have objective evidence at hand, all right? And that things take turns that, in fact, people leaning from certain political sides of the aisle would like to simply distract you from, to make you think that this was just a big socio-economical thing. No, it was primarily a political and moral thing, and that's how we should actually remember it and study it further. I will surely make more videos about similar topics soon, hopefully. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.